Okay. So good morning, everyone. Um, when I was volunteered to do this craft lecture by Sir Charles Donovan, the original idea was to share stuff about how I approached my own work. Um, in his phrasing, kwento mo kung paano mo ginawang nobela yung mga kwento, yung mga maikling kwento. It's a very kind of shady. Anyway, I think I'll do that later on, but I think I'll also situate my own practice and my own work, and I'll also broaden the discussion a little bit. But certainly, later on we will talk about that. So a couple of disclaimers. This is not exactly a craft lecture. No, I won't be offering any specific prescriptions as regards structuring stuff. Because I really don't. It is not false modesty. I don't feel comfortable calling myself a novelist. Because my book is hardly a novel. As some people will on Goodreads will remind you. It's really a strung up some short stories cobbled up together to resemble a novel. But hopefully there are lessons that we can draw from that experience. So it's not exactly a craft lecture, but we will certainly look at how other people have done it, have approached the project of a novel from a structural perspective, and more importantly, the principles behind those decisions. So if you want to go plot driven, like what are the considerations, what are the principles involved in making that decision? If you want to subvert or violate plot-based narratives, no, certainly there are also principles behind making that decision. Um, for my own, just to very briefly touch on my own work, my project began as a short story collection. No, Sir Charleston was in my panel, my thesis panel. Um, and I think there's value in that experience, turning a bunch of short stories into a novel, a sort of novel, precisely because, as with many Filipino writers, especially Filipino writers writing in English, our instruction, our education in fiction really begins with a short story. Because especially in English, we learn writing fiction in the classroom, and it's really hard to learn fiction the novel agad. No? So I think and throughout the history of Anglophone fiction, you have works like you know, The Woman Who Had Two Needles, by Benito King, Kulot and Son of the Enemy, and much more recently, Bush Say's Soledad's Sister. Uh, all these began as short stories. Their originating idea was not really, they're not conceptualized as novels. They were sort of extended from a short story. But on the other hand, I want to issue a giant disclaimer. No? I understand that many writers are very protective about their processes. No? So if you feel like you're an intuitive writer, you don't want to be conscious about stuff, be my guest. Ignore everything after this one. Now, on the other hand, that might be harder to do. Yung sabi ni Sen mo kanina, no? Siguro for poetry or even for short story, it might be easier to be intuitive about your process. No? Jose Lisa is famous for being this way. No? It's a short story at least. No? He begins with a catchy image or a dialogue or a scene, and then he doesn't think too much about it. He just like ang kanyang phrasing doon, parang let the games begin. Parang what's gonna happen. He doesn't. He try to not be so conscious of what's gonna happen. That kind of process certainly has its value, but it might be harder to do if you're doing a novel. No? So there's certainly a lot more to manage. You have to manage again. No? So certain many decisions about time, about chapters, about a bunch of characters, about the voice, about point of view, etc. No? So it's such a the animal to manage. No? So you might be on one hand. I'm sure wonderful novels have been written without plan or being too conscious about the design, but in the workshop. No? So there might be value in, at the very least, if you don't want your writing to be infected by that overeating, overly conscious. No, many of the things that we will touch on are actually lessons on reading. And of course, as you know, no reading and the acts of reading and writing are intertwined. So the better, the more alert you are to what you read, the more capable that you will be in terms of reproducing that. If you gravitate towards one model, etc. Ano, parang so the more attuned you are to the tricks of fiction and to see how fiction does what it does, parang the better you are equipped to doing that on your own. Okay, so the quick presentation will proceed this way. So I'll talk about structure very broadly, talk about the story, even before talking about plot, and then finally I'll talk about ways or strategies that are resistant to plot. You know? I understand that Dr. Hidalgo will give a lecture on the fragmentary novel, so that's gonna hopefully deepen our rudimentary discussion on strategies that are resistant to plot. No? So to begin with, I'm gonna go into teacher mode, and I'm gonna ask, is anyone familiar with Murakami? First, everyone's familiar with Murakami. No? What do you, and don't be shy, uh, when you hear Murakami, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Anyway, if no one volunteers, I'm gonna call on Miguel.
Oh my god.
Because my father's did that last set.
Oh my god.
Sige, Miguel.
Um, Super Frog saves Tokyo.
Okay.
Yeah, that collection because and then landscape with flat iron. Because I was, that was a story that was assigned to me and I read it. Oh, sad.
So what comes to mind? Sadness?
Sadness, but also there's this in-depth character analysis because the stories in that collection they're not about the disaster itself. It's about the personal aftermath. You know.
So it's yeah, he's very attuned to that kind of collective Japanese psyche. No? Parang he has a entire collection dedicated to the well not dedicated, but set after the 1995 boom earthquake, and then how various cast of characters reacted to it. Any other thoughts? What comes to mind? Rohan.
Station.
Sorry. Okay. Right. Uh, you want to elaborate? Or?
The curving.
Sure.
Overload it. I like to read what parang the founders or pros. So I feel it's not fair.
Sure. Yeah. Personally, I stopped reading Murakami up until I-284. Kasi doon talaga naging full. Parang before that, the novels, there were hints of misogyny somewhere there. But then at one point in the novel, it became too evident to ignore. So like you, yun nga, no? There's always a male protagonist, usually an everyman, someone in his 30s, purely unremarkable, chronically boring, parang made to be boring, etc. No, parang it's really, that's the prototypical Murakami protagonist. No? And then there's always a task involved somewhere in the novel, and more often than not, that includes rescuing a woman. And a woman with pretty ears, yung mga ganyan details na recording them. Okay, sige, that's Murakami. And I read all of this in my younger days. Is anyone familiar with any of these novels? Okay. And then tell us something about it. Mhm. Anyone? And then what comes to mind? Or parang what was your, if you've read it, what struck you? If you haven't read it, okay. In what way?
Yung, um, yung Revolution according to Raymond de Mata, ito yung novela ni Gina Apostol na unapologetic siya for instance in inserting Waray words. And because I can understand Waray, I find it very humorous actually. I was laughing all throughout the novel and I enjoyed it a lot. Although I cannot summarize for you in one sentence what the novel is all about. Based on the good squad ni Jennifer Egan, it's I like the characters, no? The tone, they have a different sensibility. They're sarcastic, no? Dark humor.
Okay, meron ba? Okay, sige. So we'll talk about the revolution according to Rene Domata. So this is a uh, it's composed of it consists of a fictitious biography. It's a rescued it's a recovered manuscript of a fictitious biography by the person who accompanied it's a katipunero. The person who accompanied Dr. Pio Valenzuela in his visit to Jose Rizal in Agapita. No? So according to the universe that Gina Apostol has created, they recovered that biography. It's not really complete, no, parang it's disheveled, it's very, it's tattered in many places, many texts are unreadable, etc. So that's the main text, supposedly, parang this nearly indecipherable text, no? And then in the footnotes, you have three voices differing about what the text, the main text means. So you have a historian, you have a translator, and then you have a someone from the point of view of psychoanalysis, analyzing the text. So you have at any point in the novel four storylines going on. Of course, it's a comment on history being fragmented, etc. All those history being constantly uh, constructed, ganyan. Whenever I assign this to my students, they hate me. It's really nearly inscrutable. Pero yun nga, ako, I find it funny. No? It's very funny, but it's a very specific kind of humor. No? Yeah, and it's not gonna be a best. Anyway, okay. The Egan book, Visit from the Moon Squad. Yeah, no, it won the Pulitzer a few years ago, and it's composed of short stories stitched into a novel. This is actually the inspiration for my own text. Anyway, Pale Fire is kind of similar to the Raymond Mata. You have and then later we'll talk about all this. Okay. So what do we notice based on the Murakami set and this set of novels? No? So we talk about structure. Intuitively or on a superficial level, um, people categorize, or at least many readers categorize works based on how attentive, on how much of a premium the writer has placed on structure. If you talk about Murakami, of course, Murakami also works with structure in a certain way. But when you remember Murakami, you remember talking cats, you remember women, you remember cooking, etc. Parang the narrative structure, the architecture of his novels rarely enter the conversation. And yet, when you have this bunch of novels, Hopscotch, Pale Fire, etc., all these, it is capable, it's inevitable to talk about the novels without at least mentioning the structure. So the structure is really what distinguishes them from the other works. Just very preliminary thoughts. Again, these are all preliminary, these are all notes, just preliminary observations. So regardless of how attentive you are to your work, from a reader's point of view, structure or form, they tend to be obtrusive, quote unquote, when you veer away from, violate, or resist conventional narrative structure. So again, this might seem automatic, or this might seem intuitive to us, but at least as writers, you have to be conscious of this. Whether you're, so I noticed, for instance, that uh, the young adult writers, the submissions are so meticulously well plotted for some reason. They follow the Aristotelian structure, etc. So maybe that's intuitive or maybe that's learned, but at the very least, no, you have to be conscious of the range of structural possibilities. No? Otherwise, the story or content can render it superficially uh, invisible. So the first point, perhaps, that the latter set teaches us is that that whole metafiction thing. No, parang, because you're reading such a structurally adventurous text, you're constantly reminded that what you're reading is text. no? As opposed to the typical mode in which you read fiction, the willing, quote unquote, willing suspension of disbelief, there's a Coleridge formulation, but the formulation is by Coleridge, originally intended for appreciation of fantasy in other modes, meaning when you read fantasy, when you read all these modes, you're supposed to believe the premise. You're supposed to not argue against it. When you're reading something, you're not supposed to say, but that doesn't happen in real life. So parang the contract between the reader and the writer is you have to believe the premise. That kind of works in a similar fashion when you're reading realist text or most realist texts, as opposed to formally adventurous texts. So when you're reading Murakami, for instance, you're immersed in the story. You're not parang there's an illusion created that you're actually reading something on a page, as opposed to these formally inventive novels in which you're constantly reminded that what you're reading is not actually real. What you're reading is artificial. What you're reading is artifice. So again, another provisional and preliminary point. So structure, as opposed as in many aspiring, any beginning writers tend to focus on content. It's the story, of course, and that's inevitable to a certain extent. But we learn from all these formally adventurous texts that structure is also a source of meaning. Structure, you can communicate a whole bunch of meaning from the structure alone, and that can complement the story or the narrative that you're trying to say. That's mostly through how, because it dictates how actively a reader may or can participate in the reading of the text, making the reading experience also a source of meaning. For instance, Hopscotch, the Cortazar novel, there are instructions in front before you read them. Parang for the if you're reading this, you can read up to from chapter one to chapter 72, and then that's okay. Parang you can stop with that. That's about halfway the novel. And then for the more enthusiastic readers, you can read it this way, and then there's a literal sequence of numbers that you can follow beyond the normal reading. There's also a novel, parang ganito yung, the most primitive, not primitive, but the most familiar operation resembles the choose your own adventure books. No? But it actively invites the reader to participate in the reading process. And that alone is a comment on fiction, a comment on literature, etc. Okay, on the other hand, we're probably, when someone is, when Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis is mentioned, um, it's always content. Parang when you hear someone, when you hear Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, you always, um, the first thing that comes to mind is a guy turning to a hermit. Regular sons of learning. On the other hand, upon closer, again, so that's supposed to be, if you're going to go back to that broad categorization, metamorphosis is supposedly under the content or the story uh, novel, or novella. And yet, if you actually scrutinize the structure of the metamorphosis, there are more possibilities that can add to that storyline. Now, for instance, it's also uh, cut into three parts, three acts. It's a classic three-act structure. Each act is each act ends whenever Gregor tries to come out of his room. So whenever Gregor tries to come out of his room, of course, you have a big bug coming out of the room, so nothing wonderful is going to emerge from that. So after attempt to escape is thwarted by some reason, the act ends, and then you begin again. So what does that add to our understanding of Gregor Samsa's life? And again, similar to what Dr. Asena mentioned a while ago, this is also uh, uh, interesting because the entirety of its very appealing premise is captured right from the first sentence. So Trevor Samsa awoke one morning from his dreams to to find himself transformed into a monstrous vermin. The entirety of the conflict of the subsequent 10,000 words is captured right from the get-go. So right from the first sentence, you know what's going to happen here, and you know the adventure that this creature, that this character is going to take. So those, I just cited a couple, but my point is, um, even in less obvious ways. So even in less obvious ways, structure can also add or augment or appreciation of the text. For instance, you will know that the metamorphosis is about the futility of struggle, etc. You know that from the storyline already. And yet, when you scrutinize its structure, the structure actually reinforces that very idea. The way that it ends up an act, the way it opens an act, etc. All these are, and I'm sure, well, actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Kafka has read Aristotle. Who knows? No, but even in uh, texts that are not known to be formally adventurous, structure it is still instrumentalized, or the structure is still uh, used, to add to augment our understanding of the text. Okay, so just a quick review now. I'm sure all of you have taken Edition 11 or U13 or Hume 1, etc. So let's go to the story. What I call the story. And plot, when we talk about plot is important to the story. So according to Aristotle, again, this formulation is um, originally applied to tragedy and to theater. According to Aristotle, one is what has a beginning, middle, and end. It's a classically structure composed of setup, confrontation, resolution. It also sort of mirrors, at least resembles the monomyth or the Campbell's hero's journey, departure, initiation, return, and many uh, characters, fictional or not, mythical or not, follow this kind of journey. Okay, so the Aristotelian formulation is important because it was the first time that causality was brought into the picture. According to in the latter parts of his quote, Aristotle proceeded to define beginning, middle, and end by virtue of causality. So you cannot reach the second part without uh, logically following what happens before. So 2000 or so years ago, that kind of causality is already central to any modes of storytelling. Now, in many ways, some people say it's inherent to the human species to seek out causality in nature. We're naturally pattern-seeking individuals, so pattern-seeking species. And so whenever you see, whenever you come across a couple of even unrelated phenomena, there is a natural tendency to sort of connect the two. So in many ways, when you think of a story in the classic sense, that kind of the centrality of causality has always been there. And that's yeah, and that's elaborated by this like structure, setup, confrontation, and resolution. We'll not talk about this. The important thing to consider here is that the principle behind this causality, and the reason why some novelists or some writers resist that is when you think of the story in this conventional way, the assumption is that you want to develop sympathy for the protagonist or the character. So if your concern is to develop a fully rounded character, and you want your work to revolve around that character, this is one of the most reliable structure to pursue. So again, it really depends on what you want to do in your work. Okay, but the story, quote unquote, the story as a notion, as an idea, doesn't quite behave in the same way in the novel as it did in the earlier forms of storytelling, especially oral storytelling. I have three quotes, three lines from uh, three very smart people. I'll give you a second to read. So the first one is in Forster, the aspects of the novel, Walter Benjamin, the storyteller, and then George Lucas from the theory of the novel. So notice that all these pronouncements were made in the 1920s to the 1930s. The world is undergoing severe change, social change, and something is happening to the story. What's common among these? The story remains, according to the three, the story remains to be central to the novel. The story in the archaic, in the primitive, in the atavistic sense, remains to be central in the novel. And yet, there's also something different in the way that it behaves in the context of a novel. According to Walter Benjamin in The Storyteller, it's a review, an essay on a Russian writer. The storyteller in the primal sense, in the primitive sense, has disappeared and has been replaced by fiction writers. And in the way that the story is told orally is no longer the same because of that. Of course, it points out several phenomena behind this, like, development of printing, invention of printing. So there is now focus on the materiality of the book as opposed to the oral quality of the story. Now it also changed the way that stories are consumed, meaning ngayon because of the novel, because of printing, stories can be consumed um, privately as opposed to a collective experience. No? And I'm gonna read the last change. So it's philosophical. According to Lucas, it's the same formulation, and yet Lucas says the change is also very philosophical. No? It's because the novel emerged from the loss of meaningful community or totality. Meaning, it's now after the First World War, it's now impossible to sort of tell a story from a totalitarian, from a perspective that humanity is a totality or a community. Ngayon, no, humanity is structured, society is fragmented, etc. And so that has to be reflected in the way that novels tell stories. And so the novel becomes a way to look for ito ang pinaka-famous formulation ng Lukács ay yung transcendental homelessness about the novel. So according to him, the novel, because of that loss of totality, the novel becomes a way for the novelist to look for home, even as this no longer the home no longer exists. So therefore, the novel, according to Lukács, is focused on process. It's always a search for meaning. It's always a search for idea. If you notice in the third excerpt, dito din lumabas yung the idea of the novel as an explicit investigation of an idea. So after this one, from Lukács's observation, a novel is no longer preoccupied with narrative itself. It also has to investigate certain phenomena. So hindi lang siya kwento. It also investigates processes. Okay, so therefore, some of the things that we can deduce from different pronouncements. No? So in many ways, it's actually form. Now, what distinguishes the behavior of the story in the novel vis-a-vis how the story behaves in the earlier forms of storytelling, it's actually the form. How the novelist, how the writer manipulates structure, and how the novel has an appetite for ideas. So those two things. So it distinguishes the novel from all the narratives of sustained length. Mang Jen mentioned the depth of the epics, the metrical romances, etc. But what distinguishes the modern novel is structural manipulation, the way that the novelist manages time, manages characters, manages voices, etc. But at the same time, it's capacity to investigate ideas. I will not talk about this at length, no, but James Wood is very interesting formulation of what distinguishes modern fiction from older narratives. No? And then according to him, it's the evolution of consciousness. No? And the way he charts this is from Job to cite the Bible, to Macbeth, or Shakespearean tragedy, and to Raskolnikov, as according to him, one of the first manifestations of that modern consciousness in fiction. No? You also need to talk about structure, whether it complements or it's activated by structure, and the novel's capacity for heteroglossia. Yet another favorite concept of Athenian novelties. Heteroglossia by Bakhtin, and the novelistic counterpoint or polyphony by Condev. Basically, heteroglossia, the many voices, many registers, as opposed to Bakhtin, compared the modern novel, for instance, compared it with the epic. In the epic, you have one high, it's always a high register. It's always a bard telling the story, as opposed to the novel, which has the capacity to be populated by a whole bunch of voices, meaning registers according to class, registers according to profession, registers according to gender, even to city or country, etc. So that kind of capacity is inherent in the novel. According to Kundera, there's a similar concept of the novelistic counterpoint. According to him, it's a very basic idea. No? According to him, the polyphony in the novel allows the novelist to play among different kinds of writing. The essayistic, dreamlike kind of writing than the main conventional narrative. It also um, allows the novelist to play with temporal shifts, time shifts, chronological displacement. We know all this already. So all these are not perhaps we know this intuitively. When you read a novel, of course, expect a bunch of characters talk in different ways. But it's probably there's probably value in paying close attention to this capacity of the novel. Nagbabago ba yung boses ng mga characters? Nagbabago ba yung boses ng mga nagbabago ba yung time shifts, etc. Okay, so now we go to plot. So the most famous formulation of plot, again, I'm not sure why it's famous because it doesn't really introduce anything new. Actually, it's really because of causality. So according to Ian Forster, the king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. Another definition, a unique person, the intelligible whole that governs a succession of events in the story. Vladimir Prop, a connected series of events that leads to a resolution of the problem or conflict with which the story began. And then finally, the design and intention of narrative, a structure for those meanings that develop through succession in time, the logic that develops its propositions. So what's common among all these? So the common assumptions of plot, behind plot, narrative unity, causation, a certain cohesion, resolution, or convergence. The telos, the theology. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So we'll go to some illustrations. Yeah, because an important point is when a novel or when a text is non-linear or circuitously plotted, it's still plotted. But it still follows the above principles of organization. There's still unity, but they're kind of arranged or sequenced in a different way. So it's important to make that distinction. So some texts appear circuitous and non-linear, and some people categorize them as non-anti-plot, etc. Actually, they're still unified and coherent. It's just arranged differently. Okay, so some. Okay. What can complicate otherwise conventional thought? And then we'll give some examples. So again, and these are all connected to the principles already mentioned earlier, in relation to consciousness, in relation to voices, in relation to time shifts, etc. So the many ways in which conventional thought can be destabilized, because some people are not so keen in the usual conventional thought. So management of temporality, time management, how you manage time in fiction. You want to uh, encompass the 70, 80 years that a person has lived, or do you want to focus on like 5 years, no? And how you treat time in the text, the concealment and revelation, just exactly how much you want to reveal in the beginning, and uh, um, what kind of details you want to reveal, as opposed to what kind of details you want to conceal. Manipulation of point of view, or the invention of the introduction of unreliability, and then taken in by a context in discourse or language flow. I'll give some specific texts. So these are just um, some of my favorite novels, like generally, so like The God of Small Things, I don't know, I have to say I met her, and she's wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about God of Small Things for instance. So if you uh, plot The God of Small Things, the storyline is actually quite basic, right? Not basic in the shady way, but it's actually quite straightforward. But what the writer does is to sort of purposefully make everything convoluted. So if you notice have you read all the small things? Yeah. Okay, so the structure of Body Small Things is kind of circular. There's basically there's a balikbayan, and the balikbayan died. Is a 30-year-old um, UK-born daughter of Indian parents. The mother is British and then the father is Indian. And then they go home in the whole Balikbayan, that Balikbayan faction, under or partly dedicated to them, their welcome with hospitality, etc. And then she plays with the main protagonist, paternal prince. And then because of it's um, because of the twins' mother's affair with an untouchable, the Balikbayan kid dies, drowns in the river. No? So that's kind of it. No? Parang you can actually sort of capture the entirety of the narrative of the other small things in a couple of sentences. No? And yet, how does Arundhati Roy manipulate that, or play with form, in order to sort of taking the narrative, or managing the narrative purposefully? No? First of all, when the novel opens, uh, we already know that the Balikbayan kid is dead. So there's no concealment of that. The intention is really to find out how you got from this point to that point. But it's not one of those, it doesn't hinge on that shock value that someone has died. So it's revealed from the very beginning. And then the rest of the novel, from that point onward, kind of circles around that. Parang you get to find out uh, events in relation to that central grand event, and yet not quite approaching it. So, okay. And so every now and then you kind of approach it, and yet it's dangled tantalizingly, and you don't quite approach it, and that's kind of the mechanism that propels the forward movement of this novel. So what does Arundhati Roy uh, make use of? So management of temporality, concealment and revelation, etc. No? The known one is about a black slave owner. So again, it's a very provocative premise. Right? Little known fact about slavery is that there are a lot of black African American uh, people who actually own slaves. So that's the entirety of the premise of the known world. And how does Edward P. Jones um, ano ba, elaborate on this premise? No? There's also what precipitates the event in the novel is that the main character, Henry Townsend, dies. So and there's brewing rebellion in this slave plantation. So this slave black owner, after um, after managing the plantation well, there's of course there's moral quandaries around that point. No? But so what precipitates the fact is, yeah, the black slave owner dies, and then there's growing sort of growing unrest in the slave plantation. And what the novel does is it sticks to third person omniscient, and yet it also uh, and yet it also is told from the point of view of many of the characters. So, and at the end of towards the end of the novel, all these divergent points of views converge uh, to make way for the ending of I won't talk about right now. Okay, so we return to the when you want to um, uh, structure your text via the conventional plot. So we return to the common assumptions, the unity, causation, cohesion, resolution. Just it's probably important to take note that there are uh, political implications to that decision. It means probably that you think the world functions in more or less a similar way. Now, you think there's a causal relationship to things. Things happen for a reason, etc. No, society, art, etc. Reality is explainable, etc. And most importantly, I think, no, um, you believe that things can be resolved. And again, that might, so sometimes you think it's only a matter of plot, but actually the way you choose to structure your work actually reveals more things about your point of view. And for instance, in the if a writer chooses to not end the story in a particular way, not conclusively end the story, there probably is a commentary on, well, why does it have to end a certain way? Why does things have to end conclusively? So just a quick uh, illustration. So Pale Fire, it consists of a couple of texts. So a long poem of four cantos, ostensibly charting a reason with the poet's life, and then right after that, there's an annotation by a possibly deranged critic, the self-proclaimed best friend of the poet, who may or may not be the escaped monarch of a fictitious European kingdom. So a couple of narrative threads there, and several ways of reading. If you're a patient reader, and if you like poetry, uh, you can read the poem first, and whenever there's a footnote, you can go to the annotation. It's a very difficult way of reading. But if you're impatient, like me, you go straight to the footnotes. So the footnotes contain the meat of the story. So what does that mean? Okay, so again, already from the outset, a couple of narrative threads. Parang that's already satisfying. There's already an interesting story there. And yet, what does the novel gain from being arranged this way? Well, there's additional commentary on academia, on fiction and literature, and on the sense of reality. Okay, um, so that's okay. So, as I said, no, so Dr. General, we will talk about the fragmented novels. We really won't have to go too deep in talking about ways of resisting a lot. No? So, according to Forrester, ganyan, this is in 1920s. No? So, as early as then, the question of why does a novel have to be coherent? Or why does a novel have to reach a certain comfortable closure? Things like these are already being questioned. No? The plot is exciting and maybe beautiful, but cannot fiction devise a framework that is not so logical yet more suitable to its genius? Also, and I think another important thing we have to remember, or we have to be alert to, um, while this kind of proposition against plot is not new, I think it has achieved renewed currency, especially today. If you watch, I recently discovered this show called Sensitive. It's a wonderful way of storytelling. And then I realized that actually Cortázar has been doing that same thing. He has a short story in which uh, present day um, Argentinian person switches consciousness with an Aztec slave or something. So that kind of hyperlink consciousness is not it is not human fiction, but it's I observed that it has been increasingly appealing to this generation of kids. Because their kind of reality is really structured in a fragmented fashion. At any given point when you're browsing the web, you have like you're kind postmodern experience is already um, automatic to certain people, which is probably why I would serve with Athenian undergrads. It's increasingly hard to write a 5,000 word short story. So yeah, their brains seem to be increasingly wired to write fragments, instead of like a sustained narrative. You don't have to. That's not necessarily a bad thing. No? Yeah, so some principles. So fragmentation, regression, etc. instead of ambiguity, arbitrariness instead of causality, open-endedness instead of resolution. So just sequencing non-plot-based sequencing strategies by certain novelists. So Jonathan Franzen has been known to go on long, digressive, essayistic modes. Jonathan Franzen, Proust. Is known to develop like one concept and develop a novel based on that. No, we're also architectonic, numerological, geometrical, alphabetical ways of arranging. Now, Kaplan, amazing New Zealand writer, her novel, The Luminaries, uh, is a whodunit, is a classic murder mystery, and yet, and she structures it from 12 points of view, and each points of view correspond to the 12 zodiac signs. And each point of view, each character follow the descriptions of each zodiac sign, and they also uh, move towards the resolution of the murder mystery. And then the chapters get increasing, uh, get increasingly shorter, increasingly shorter to reflect the lunar cycle for each zodiac sign. You like that. No? Repetition. Pavlik is known to organize uh, his his um, his novels in a dictionary format, in a crossword format, etc. For the Tsar, you can choose your own adventure. The novel and stories um, conventionally attributed to Wansberg to Howard Anderson, and then Jennifer Egan is the most famous practitioner today. Okay, so just a final bit. Okay, so I'll go to my work. So when I was assembling my manuscript for publication, this meme came out. I'll read it. Nicely drawn characters with strenuously contrived link, but we'll call it a novel anyway. And then it's titled Six Tenuously Connected Narratives. And it really spoke to me. Kasi, um, so and I was thinking of ways to, it's kind of a stubbornness, that I produced this collection of stories, and yet they all happen in one universe, so I wanted to mangle them to resemble a novel. And then I remember during the thesis defense, Sir Charleston said, um, parang ganito lang sa ano, kasi I write anti-colonial, supposedly anti-colonial. So sabi niya, parang ganito lang sa ano. Mas gusto ko yung mga love stories. I'm not sure if you remember. So I thought of organizing my manuscript based on the strength, which is supposedly the romance, the romance part, the pay So ngayon, my book is divided into four pay supposedly, well, thematically, my intention was to sort of undermine, to bring a counterpoint to the strong politics. As if the politics is strong, I was under the impression, or in the sense that the Romans part sort of undercut that. So parang hindi masyadong obtrusive yung work. No? But I agree with Jen. No? When you're preparing, when you're writing a novel, when you're preparing a novel, finding the structure is really the most difficult part. Especially if the attempt to write a novel comes towards the end. I didn't really wanted to write a novel. I wanted to write a short story collection. And finding finding a point for that, in order for it to resemble a novel, it was really a challenge. So I think I learned, and based on the foregoing uh, discussion. And so the behavior of the novel on the page is often connected to what it seeks to do. What do you want to do? Do you want to tell a story? Do you want to investigate the phenomenon? Or both? No? So as you may know or not know intuitively, no, focus on or intention to structure can depend on what kind of experience and meaning making that you want to activate in the course of writing a book. No? Of course, there need not be a strict dichotomy between structure and story. No? A bunch of writers, it's been many writers do both simultaneously. They tell a story and they also investigate the phenomenon. And and not incidentally, these are the writers who gravitate towards. So they do something both narratively and discursively. So the Echo, Borges, Hector Guillermo, and Virginia Apostol. No, but just a final note, because of its sprawling capaciousness, the novel as a genre is alert to the sensitivities of the time. So that might include the hyperlinked, fragmented nature of experience in social media, etc. So this kind of aspect that the novel can do is something that structure can reflect and enact. And so when you're making a decision, it's not, of course, the story should dictate, the content should dictate the structure. No, but if you're not conscious about structure, you might not be taking full advantage of the possibilities that the novel as a form can enact and can reflect.
Thank you very much, Sir Glenn. We have room for a couple of questions siguro, kung meron, yung mga co-fellows natin. Who would want to hit it? Or gutom na kayo?
Sorry.
Anyone? Yes, PJ.
Hi. I'd like to ask, in your view, which would be more important, I guess, in terms of telling a story? Is it the storytelling voice or the context, or sorry, the content of a story?
I don't think the two were inseparable. I've heard from many writers finding the voice is crucial to even begin telling the story. But when you're, kasi kahit na, it doesn't have to be like a first person content. Kahit na you're telling a third person narrative, the voice is still important. No? So yeah, I think that the two are inseparable because whatever story you want to tell will definitely dictate the voice, the most effective voice to tell that story. It's very general.
One last question. Anyone? I do.
From batch 1, inaugural batch ng ALB.
Could you touch on accessibility? Kasi a lot of it's getting published in the Philippines is a question about sales sometimes. So when I was inquiring with this print on how to get published, talagang in the email you have to say how it's gonna sell, who it's gonna sell to. I have to go, wow, I have to think of that when writing. So could you talk about accessibility as well?
I think the publishers are better suited to answer that. Pero yun nga, yun. But from my own personal perspective, nagod din ako doon. When I was asked, when I submitted the manuscript and then that same question was asked of me, my knee-jerk reaction was, that's not my job, it's your job. Of course you can say that. No? But in terms of the writing, I certainly, because my book is about call center agents, it's like the call center industry, and my target audience are call center agents. So there was an attempt to not dumb it down, but make it accessible, make it enjoyable, etc. Because otherwise, we'll be reading each other. The writers will be reading each other when it's not very
Alright. Ayun, so dito po nagtatapos ng ating morning sessions. Palakpakan natin si Glenn. Sa puntong ito, maaari na tayong mananghalian, no? So, at after nating mananghalian, pwede na rin po tayo mag-check-in